Of Christmases Long, Long Ago is my new book arriving for the 2025 Christmas season. Find out what Christmas was like centuries ago. Sneak preview, it was weird, and spooky, and rowdy, kinda gross sometimes. Find it wherever books are sold in hardcover from Lyons Press and audiobook from Recorded Books. It's Christmas as you've never seen it before, and it makes a great gift. Hey, it's Brian, dropping by once more to keep the countdown going to the kickoff of the Christmas Past 2025 main season on Thanksgiving Day. That's less than a week from now if you're listening in real time. Whether you've been following along since October, or just dropping in now, or even listening from the future, I'm glad to have you along for the ride. I hope you're as excited as I am to share another season together. It'll be our 10th one as one big happy Christmas Past family. There's lots of new fun and surprises in store this year, as well as most of the stuff you're expecting. This is another one of those years where the season is painfully short. There can be as many as 33 and as few as 27 days between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and this year it's only 28. It's gonna go by quickly, so we'll have to make the most of the time we have together. Today's episode will be the last of the pre-season. Over the past several weeks, I've been bringing you stories as well as interviews with authors leading the conversation about Christmas today, including today's guest. Vaughn Joy has a doctorate in history. Her work focuses on how popular culture both creates and responds to the world around it. Her latest book is Selling Out Santa: Hollywood Films in the Age of McCarthy. I recently caught up with Dr. Joy for an eye-opening conversation about some of our most beloved Christmas movies and the cultural and historical context they were born from. I'll come back at the end to wrap up. Here's my conversation with Vaughn Joy. Vaughn Joy, welcome to Christmas Past.
Thank you for having me.
Your new book is Selling Out Santa: Christmas Movies in the Time of the McCarthy Era. That brings up a lot of questions or a lot of emotions. I was just talking to Thomas Rui Smith on the podcast a little while
Mhm.
ago, and we talked about how the image of Santa Claus was solidified largely through this body of 19th century American literature. But then just a handful of decades later, as we move into the early to mid 20th century in this post-war period, there is sort of a reshaping, or at least a continuation of that shaping, but it wasn't literature doing it. Then it was Christmas movies. And I think your book is tackling some of those topics, but it's through a specific lens of what else was going on in American culture.
Mhm.
So we'll get into all of it, I'm sure, but the big questions are who was selling him out and in what way were they selling him out and why and how do all of those threads play out? But why don't we, as they say, take it from the top? What is the big idea behind this book and what inspired you to write it?
So the big idea is that Christmas changes all the time, as your listeners will know. It is a very mutable kind of holiday and cultural touchstone for a lot of people, especially in American traditions. American Christmas is a very kind of fascinating subject for looking at how America develops, who is considered American, uh, what do the social and political and cultural and economic kind of moments tell us about Christmas, and what can depictions of Christmas tell us about that moment's political, social, cultural, economic kind of contexts. Um, so really starting with a fascination of Christmas and also this post-war period, um, I've always really found the post-war period fascinating for a lot of those same questions of the development of American identity and national mythologies. Um, a lot of things start to change in that post-war moment when America is feeling pretty high after World War II, feeling like a global power. And it's a period of okay, how do we want to present ourselves to the rest of the world? And simultaneously with those questions, there's a lot of history happening in that period, and we're kind of just bowling into the Cold War. And a lot of those answers of who gets to be an American, what does it mean to be an American, they start becoming very kind of serious and pressing. And in 1947, we have the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC, as most people would recognize it. We have them turn to Hollywood and try and answer the question of what is American cultural media, especially what is it to be an American? And they take it from a negative standpoint by saying you're doing un-American things.
Mhm.
So what my project does is thinks about that question of the government telling Hollywood what is and is not quote unquote American, and then uses Christmas films as a case study to see what those questions did to our cultural outputs.
Mhm.
And it uses about 12 Christmas films from the period of 1946 to 1961 to really analyze what changes in the genre in those periods, what changes about our understanding of Christmas in that period, and how can that kind of help us understand better what is changing in the wider world and the wider American culture and politics and social and economic kind of moment.
And I guess there's sort of echoes to the rapid transformation that we saw during the Victorian period, where it was this combination of societal and economic and technological forces,
Hmm.
a rising middle class, and a change in the way that we consume goods, all of that feeding into the literature and the literature feeding back into it and then shaping the season. And so we're seeing the same sort of thing happening in this post-war period. And I guess maybe we could start broadly and ask, from the beginning of this post-war period into the 60s, you mentioned that the films sort of change as a
Hmm.
result of these influences. How does it change, broadly speaking?
So in my book, I make the argument that in the 1946 and 1947 years of this study, we have some of our strongest Dickensian content, and really the only Dickensian content in this 15-year period. So it starts with Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, which is widely understood as an American reimagining or adaptation of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Then in 1947, we have three films that echo Dickensian tropes and themes that are not straightforward adaptations of A Christmas Carol, but really harken back to elements of communal goodwill and economic kind of insecurity in one's community. And those three films are It Happened on Fifth Avenue, The Bishop's Wife, and Christmas Eve. So we have a lot of this kind of front end Dickensian um, storytelling in our Christmas media. And the other film from 1947 is Miracle on 34th Street, which is a Santa Claus myth, as many know. And from that point on, in that same year in 1947, we have all of these kind of federal interventions in Hollywood. We have HUAC coming in and subpoenaing 19 unfriendly witnesses, 10 of whom are arrested or charged with contempt of Congress for refusing to answer the question about whether they are now or have ever been a member of the Communist Party of America. And we also have a Supreme Court decision the following year that breaks up the studio system. And we have all sorts of things going on in the wider political moment that's shifting towards anti-communism as default. And within the Christmas films, I argue that those Dickensian tropes, the Santa Claus myth, they get pushed aside in our Hollywood Christmas media. And for the rest of this 15-year period, up to 1961, we see multiple shifts. So we move into more farcical and musical content, more rom-coms that shift the perspective from that communalist nature of Dickensian and Santa Claus mythologies to straightforwardly individual. Much more, are we going to fall in love by Christmas Eve?
Hmm.
Like that's the most kind of complicated those films really get, and they're really pure escapism in that really tumultuous 1950s moment of fear and suspicion and nuclear aged kind of
Hmm.
terror. We get pure escapism in our Christmas content. And then by the end of the 50s and into the early 60s, there's another kind of shift with your films like The Apartment in 1960 and Babes in Toyland that have a little bit more edge to them, but are still much more focused on the individual and interpersonal conflicts than they are about the community.
Hmm. And I wonder if we can take a step back because we were talking about Dickens. And of course,
Mhm.
in A Christmas Carol, there is, the common good and goodwill toward all, but there's also this theme of capitalism and workers' rights and the rich and the
Mhm.
poor and income inequality. And you write in the book that It's a Wonderful Life, which echoes that story in a lot of ways, was actually potentially a problem when it came to, was it the FBI or the CIA or something like that
The
for those same
FBI.
reasons?
Yeah, J. Edgar Hoover had a problem with it. And the concern is that it was maligning the upper class and it showed bankers in a poor light. And there, the FBI in these files that are in the book and also available on the Internet Archive for those interested. They're linked in the archive of, or sorry, the appendix of my book. Um, these files are written by redacted FBI informers who state at the start of them that they are not trained film analysts, but they are using a set of kind of written rules by Ayn Rand in a screen guide for Americans that was published by the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, which was a Hollywood group. And so we get this kind of narrative in these internal files, these memos of the FBI in their LA office in the late 40s and 50s about potential communist sympathies in films. Um, Ultimately, if you've seen It's a Wonderful Life, there's a really strong case to be made, and the case that I make in my book that it's about two bankers, and one of them is a very good banker, being George Bailey, the Jimmy Stewart star, um, pitted against a bad banker. And I don't think that that is un-American. I think it's actually deeply American to be challenging monopolism and saying it's not okay for one person to own all of the financial institutions and media outlets and have the police in his pocket. That's pretty distinctly un-American for a lot of historical reasons that, again, I talk about in the book. Um, but the FBI was concerned about it for sure.
I wonder about how these movies went on to shape Christmas in the time that they were released. We think of a Christmas movie now as something, you watch every year, you watch it with your family. That wasn't possible until there was television. People weren't going to the movie
Mhm.
theater every year with their family to see the same movies over and over again. A lot of these movies in the time were released in July. They kind of
Mhm.
came and went. And so a lot of the impact that they had, and this is just my own take, tell me if I'm wrong, came decades and decades later. At least a lot of the cultural impact of it being recognized as a favorite Christmas movie. When these were released, do you have a sense that they had any sort of direct or indirect impact on what moviegoers came to expect? How it its influence bled into the rest of Christmas, or how it affected just the next Christmas movie that came along?
That's a really great question. And you're absolutely right that they became classics much later. It's a Wonderful Life really didn't reach its kind of cult Christmas status until the late 70s due to a copyright lapse, and it was able to be shown on TV regularly around the Christmas period. So it kind of re-entered the cultural, kind of popular imagination of Christmas at that point. In the 40s and 50s, I would definitely say that there are two answers. So, one is that there's a great argument that I borrow in the book from Peter Rothman and Jim Purdy, who talk about the decline of the social problem film in American cinema. And they're looking at periods before I am, before the post-war period, largely. But they give the example that in the 1920s, there was a better economy. People were more flush with cash. So they were more open to seeing that on screen. Whereas in the 30s, seeing a protagonist with a lot of money was not something that people wanted to see on screen. It wasn't really aspirational at a point when there is such horrible kind of inequality in the general population. So with that kind of argument in mind, I do think that as the economy was changing in the 1950s, we can see in these films a shift in how commerce is depicted, how the commercialism of Christmas changes from 46 to 61. And in the book, there is a case study on how mink coats specifically are depicted in the films through this 15-year period to show exactly that, that there is a kind of conversation with the audience and with the general public of America and how certain things are shown or adapted year to year and throughout this whole period.
And so, taking that one example, how does the depiction of mink coats shift over that time?
So it goes along the lines of the kind of um, the health of the U.S. economy in the immediate post-war period. I think we generally tend to think of it as an economic boom, but really in that kind of 45 to 49 period, there is a lull. It does uh, dip after the war before it strengthens into that kind of iconic age of affluence 1950s period. And the films do address that. I think It's a Wonderful Life is very much in that conversation that the townspeople in George are really struggling for wealth. And in It's a Wonderful Life, Violet, George's friend from childhood, she considers leaving Bedford Falls for New York City. And he asks her what she'll do for money and jokingly says, "Are you going to hawk your furs?" And
Mhm.
in that period, that idea of a fur on a woman was really associated to her sexuality and her body. So he makes this kind of insinuation that she's going to sell herself to
Mm.
get by in New York City. By the 1950s, as there is kind of more wealth around, we get a more lavish approach to minks and furs. In a film in 1955, Susan Slept Here. Um, Debbie Reynolds, who is Susan, is gifted a mink coat for Christmas, and she assumes that it does mean that she has to return sexual favors for
Mm.
it before the man says, "No, no, it's not that kind of mink." And that's a real shift from 1946 that we can see in that like 8 or 9 year period up to that point. And then again by 61, we have even more developments with the kind of cultural idea of mink as a way to access wealthy spaces. Um, so it's no longer seen as a kind of dirty thing for a woman to be wearing a mink. She didn't get it because a man gifted it to her for sexual favors. She got it by her own wealth or initiative or whatever. So there's a really interesting kind of development of just an item across these films as well.
So the shift from, more the Dickensian themes to the more, slapstick or rom-commy, d does that suggest that the current explosion of these made-for-television rom-com style movies around Christmas time can thank this period from the 1950s for laying the groundwork for the format and the genre?
I definitely think so, and I do argue that maybe in the conclusion of this book, but also in a chapter elsewhere. I think there's a direct corollary to the formula that is used for those kind of B-list films that are made now that are just churned out by Hallmark and the Great American Family Network. Um, Netflix has gotten in on it, Lifetime even. There are certain tropes that are established in this post-war period in the 1950s that are in a very high percentage of the formulaic films now. There's the high achieving woman who is single and needs a man to complete her in a domestic way. A child is often very important as a reflection of her maternal instincts, or how she is failing in her maternal instincts and needs a man to correct them. Um, and many others that I talk about in the book. Um, and they all normally end up in this kind of heteronormative relationship with a wealthier breadwinner husband. Um, and normally it is a husband. It is normally ending in a marriage or an intended marriage for sure. And we can see that. That is the formula for Hallmark and all of these other outlets that are making these formulaic Christmas films that have this kind of socially conservative glean on them. This,
That's what prompted the question. So
yes.
the they tend to be specifically apolitical, right? You know, they
Mm,
talk about soldiers, but we never hear about wars or politics or anything like that. They're conspicuously wholesome. So, you know, it sounds like something that might come out of this era where we want to have just this sanitized, wholesome kind of thing. But there's also, it's not hard to get the sense that, like, without saying so specifically, there is a bit of a conservative leaning within these. Or at least, you know, what most people would understand a conservative leaning to be.
for sure. And that is at the kind of heart of my book is this shift that we see from communalism to individualism and also into a much more solidified social conservatism around Christmas and its iconography and tropes and themes and all of those things. Um, and I think, yeah, these romance formulaic romance films um, are really scratching an itch of that 1950s nostalgia in the way that the 50s are normally constructed in our popular imagining of it. And I specifically use imagining and constructed because they don't really reflect a reality of the 1950s, or definitely not a reality for the majority of Americans in that period. But they do reflect a large portion of the Christmas media from
Mhm.
that period that was reimagining reality as it was going on, and constructing that narrative that we still use today.
So there is this hearkening to the good old days
Yeah.
of what Christmas was like in small towns and things like that.
Hmm.
But it's a there was a book that came out, I think, in the 90s called like The Way We Never Were. And it was all
Hmm.
about how the 1950s are not the way it was. It's that was, like you said, largely constructed. So your book ends with this one big chapter that comprises about a quarter of the book about Disney and Capra. Why does that warrant so much attention in a work like this?
I think it's a good question. I really love that final chapter. I think it really solidifies or exemplifies the argument that I'm making throughout the whole book. Um, this 46 to 61 period opens and closes with Frank Capra. He is at his absolute high of filmmaking with a film that he thinks is the best film anyone ever made, is what he says in his autobiography in 71, being It's a Wonderful Life. He says it was definitely his best film. And then 15 years later, he makes another Christmas film, Pocket Full of Miracles, that does so poorly, is so poorly received that he really retires from filmmaking. A few years later, he makes a documentary, but he retires from kind of fiction filmmaking, and that documentary is his last film ever. And part of the real question of the book is why? Why does that happen? Why does someone who is at the absolute peak of um, American cinema have such a career demise by 15 years later? And likewise, Disney is on this upwards trajectory that just keeps going up, from the late 40s when Disney was in very close to bankruptcy and Cinderella had to save their finances in 1950 to opening Disneyland, Disneyland in 55 and having the shows and becoming a kind of media empire by the early 60s. So pairing the two of them and seeing what changes for them as filmmakers in this context of the turbulence of the late 40s for Hollywood, the nuclear age terror, the baby boom happening, TV exploding. What is it that leads to those kind of conclusions for them by 61, or ascendancy for Disney? And that chapter is about a quarter of the book. It takes a long time, takes its time, to lay those out of what's happening for each of them throughout the 1950s. And then also slots in the apartment right in the middle of the chapter to give us a grounding of it's not just the two of them, there are other contexts here to be considering. So it's kind of the crown jewel of the book. It exemplifies the whole argument thus far in the two of them and their successes or failures.
So what is the bigger picture? What do we want people to take away from reading a book like this, in terms of understanding Christmas movies then and now, or just understanding the influence of government and the media on Christmas literature or Christmas content? And what is the big take-home message?
I think all of the above. I would really love for, well, people to enjoy the book. I hope it's an enjoyable read. But I also would really hope that the takeaway is a larger idea of media literacy, of how we can look at, as you said, these films are largely apolitical. And we think of them as apolitical because they're not looking at specifically political ideas or events. But they are political in the fact that they are showing American life and constructing that post-war American identity, and national mythology. So I would love that if people who read this book can come away from it with a better, stronger understanding of how to parse the media that they are watching, especially media that they watch passively, like we do with Christmas films, to have a stronger understanding of the influences on films and periods and how Hollywood decides what is being made and how it's going to be made and who's going to make it. These are very, very big questions, and Hollywood is an incredibly difficult industry to really wrap your mind around how it works and why. But I hope that my book helps shed some light on that, and encourages people to be more critical of the media that they're watching and to still enjoy their Christmas films.
Mhm.
Even if they do have all of this messaging within them that you should be aware of, you should just be aware of it. But you can I still watch Hallmark Christmas movies on like a constant stream over the Christmas period. So enjoy it all, but be aware of what you're hearing and consuming and taking part in.
Bon Joy, Merry Christmas, and thank you very much for coming on Christmas Past.
Merry Christmas. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that discussion. Again, that new book is Selling Out Santa, Hollywood Christmas Films in the Age of McCarthy. You can find a link in the show notes for more information. I hope your festive season is off to a wonderful start, and I'm grateful we get to spend another season together. Stay subscribed to the podcast and don't forget to join me on Thanksgiving Day as we officially kick off another Christmas season together. I've been mentioning this all throughout the pre-season, but this season of Christmas Past we're doing things ever so slightly differently, and I'll share more details about that when the time is right. But some things will never change, like how I want to hear from you and about your Christmas memories. I'd love to share one with the rest of the Christmas Past family this season. All you have to do is record yourself speaking into your phone's voice memo app and send it to christmaspastpodcast@gmail.com. Just keep it reasonably short, clean, and family-friendly, and be sure to say your name and where you're from. Christmas Past is produced in wonderful Willow Glen, California by yours truly, Brian Earl. Thank you to Vaughn Joy, and thank you for listening. You can drop me a line anytime, as a lot of you already have. I always love to hear from you, and I try to respond to every message I get. whether it's to say hello, share a Christmas memory, or anything else. Again, I'm at christmaspastpodcast@gmail.com, or connect with me on your favorite social media platform. And if you don't see me there and think I ought to be, reach out and let me know. And hey, if you're really feeling the Christmas spirit, why not help more people discover this show and grow the Christmas Past family? That's as simple as telling a friend about it or leaving a rating and review. If you do leave a review, I'll send you a Christmas Past sticker, and a handwritten Christmas card is my way of saying thanks any time of year. Reach out for details. And until we meet again, may your days be merry and bright.